Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder when I head out for a walk and deliver an episode to you while I stroll around. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good morning, listeners. It is a lovely December day here in suburban Chicago. The sky is partly cloudy, the sun is out, and I'm having an enjoyable walk in what is quite a lovely day. The temperature before I left said it was 29 Fahrenheit, which would be about -1 Celsius, I think, which is, pretty comfortable for December. I have hat and mittens on, but I'm not feeling too cold. We'll see how I feel by the end of the walk. Well, today I am recording a 2-part episode, so we're going to walk a little bit longer than usual, and I'll break this into 2 episodes. And today I want to talk about something that came up it started in a thread on Board Game Geek, and then I asked people for other examples, and I'm just going to kind of share the results of my thinking about this and some conversation about games and so on. But I guess I just wanted to do a check-in over the weekend. I hope that you had a pleasant weekend. It was a fun gaming weekend around my place. We played several unlock or one-play games. We played 2 unlocks and an undo, which that was my second undo. I'm not sure that I'm going to keep playing them. Well, they were okay. And one of my friends really likes them, so he keeps buying them. And if he keeps buying them and giving them to us, I will keep playing them. But I probably wouldn't seek them out on my own because they're not my favorite. Undo is, the premise is sort of like you are part of some sort of time travel group whose job it is to go back and stop bad things from happening. And you do that by, that there's going to be a death, and you have access to 15 different times that person goes to, and you go to those times and you make a decision about whether to turn a thing good or bad. And when you do that, then you either make the event better or worse, and you try to get a score based on how well you did. Both times we've played, we got 2 or 3 points, and you need 4 to be considered a success. So I was just on the cusp. It feels a little random to me. We played the Cherry Blossom Festival game, episode, whatever you call it. But that was just a check-in. So today's subject, which I said, like I said, this is going to be a two-parter, is only in board game land. That's how I'm phrasing it. So this is only in board game land, part 1. The original conversation here springs out of a forum where a conversation that happened on the Wingspan forum. Somebody posted on Wingspan, and they said that they were having an argument with their dad about, so it's actually only in board game land and then board gaming assumptions, kind of both those things together. So they said they were playing Wingspan with their dad, and their dad had an end of game bonus, or an end of round power on one of their birds that said, if you have the least birds in a particular habitat, then you score a certain number of points. And the dad had 1 bird, and the son, the person posting, had 0 birds, and the dad was arguing that he had the least number of birds because the other person didn't have any birds. And it struck me as a really interesting bit of cognitive dissonance because I absolutely understood what the dad meant. Because it's pretty common in games when you're evaluating for how well you did in a particular goal, if you have 0 in that goal, you don't get put in the running for how well you did. In fact, it's such a common thing that happens, it happens at the end of the round in Wingspan. At the end of the round in Wingspan, when you're evaluating the end of the round bonuses, you don't get any points if you don't have any thing that fits the bonus, even if you're playing the competitive mode where, say, second place gets a certain number of points. So if you, let's say it says eggs on birds in the forest area. If you're playing the competitive mode, 2-player, and one person has 3 eggs in the forest, on birds in the forest, and the other person has 0 eggs on birds in the forest, the one person gets 5 points or whatever it is for the competitive mode. The other person gets 0 points because they don't have any eggs in that mode. So it kind of makes sense that you would transfer that same rule for comparison over to another place in the game where you're making comparisons, which is who has the fewest birds in a particular habitat. And then in the conversation in the forums, Elizabeth Hargrave, the designer of Wingspan, pops in and says 0 counts as a number in this case. 0 is less birds than 1. And it struck me as a really interesting point of comparison, and I said only in board game land would you have this long argument about whether or not 0 is less than 1. And it was meant as a sort of funny joke. I posted a thread in the general forum where I said, can you think of other examples of this kind of thing? And there were a couple of good ones, but one of my favorite was somebody pointed to a really long thread where there was an argument about, can you shuffle 1 card? Right, because a game, I think it had to do with games that tell you to shuffle a deck or ask you to do something with shuffling a deck, and then you get a reward for having done so. And so if there's only 1 card left in the deck and you shuffle it, are you able to shuffle it? Particularly for a game where, like, let's say that a game has you do a thing and then you get a thing, but the rule of the game say if you can't do part A, then you can't do part B. And part A says shuffle the deck. So if there's only 1 card left, can you shuffle that 1 card? And I guess there was a really interesting argument about whether you can or cannot shuffle. And it was 4 pages of comments long, so I did not read the argument. I kind of tempted to, but I've got a lot of work to do this week. But this whole conversation got me thinking about the way that our assumptions shape what we understand to be happening when we go into play games. That, especially if you've played a lot of games, as I have, and I imagine most of you listeners have, you start to have assumptions about what should happen in a game, what's going on in a game when you play it, what a game will look like. You know, that when you're reading rules, you make sort of these assumptions about the way that the game will work. And as a result, you often make rules mistakes based on those assumptions. So what I wanted to share today, and maybe next time, we'll see how long this takes me to get through, were some experiences that I've had with bringing those assumptions over by mistake. And, you know, the Wingspan discussion is a good example of that problem. I've played a number of games that, you know, when I first started playing Wingspan, we had problems with with a couple elements. In particular, we had problems with the dice rules and with the market rules. So the dice rules, in particular, were challenging because of the way that you know whether or not you get to re-roll the dice. In Wingspan, the rule says, whenever you're about to take a die from the bird feeder for any reason, you can re-roll the dice if you don't have a choice about what thing you're going to take. And the way they define that is if all the dice are the same, then you can re-roll them. They have to be exactly the same. So if you have the face that's got a worm and a grain on it, and you have another die face that just has the worm on it, then you have a choice and you don't get to re-roll. But if they both have the worm/grain, even though you get to choose whether you want a worm or grain, that counts as not having a choice. It's okay. So the rule is whenever you're about to take food, if there's not a choice, you can re-roll. However, in the debates about this argument, that rule has gotten kind of convoluted. And honestly, I think it makes less sense than it did. I feel like Okay, well, the way the rule works out now is every time you check to see if you're going to take food, you can re-roll if you don't have a choice. And that's the part that blows my mind. So there are some bird powers that say take a thing if available. To me, if available says check the bird feeder without altering it. Like if you look in the bird feeder and there's one fish, that's all that's in there. There's no grain available. However, the way that it's been clarified in the rules is that anytime you're checking the bird feeder, if you don't have a choice, you get to re-roll the dice. Even if you wouldn't normally get to make a choice. So when it says check the bird feeder, if there's only a fish there, you can re-roll the dice. And then if you have a grain, there's a grain available and now you can take it. It's a weird rule. I do like the way that works out. If you re-roll and you get 5 of the same thing, not only get you to shout Yahtzee, I'm kidding about the shouting Yahtzee, not only do you get to shout Yahtzee, but you also then get to re-roll them again. Or not, it's your choice. The other place that we found Wingspan frustrating that actually did fit what we expected was the market. One of the things we didn't like about Wingspan, especially in the 2-player game, is there's not much churn in the market. If nobody wants the 3 birds that are there, then you're stuck. Now, I like how in the Oceania expansion, you actually can spend nectar or resources. I think just nectar. I don't remember. You can spend something to refresh the market if you don't like what's available. That's not an option in the main game. However, in the main game, you at the end of each round, you refresh the market. Frankly, whether you want to or not, which sometimes you don't want to. But yeah, in the main game, you refresh the market. And so refreshing the market is great because you get new cards available to you. And that is not something that I've seen in a lot of other games. There are a lot of games that have markets and there's no time at which you refresh them, or there is a specific thing that you do to refresh them. And that's one of those places where the assumptions I made coming in shaped how we played. We probably played 5 or 10 games of Wingspan before we realized you get to refresh the market at the end of each round. In fact, that you have to. And I only realized that because of a conversation on BGG about Wingspan. So we said, oh, don't forget you refresh the market. So Wingspan is one of those games where both you have these weird conversations that only happen in board game land, like is 1 bigger than 0? And you also have one where like, yeah, you refresh the market at the end of each round, even if you never thought you would. All right, so the second example that I wanted to bring up is deck building games. In deck building games, if you've played very many of them, often you start to get an assumption about how they work. And this can become a problem because often they don't actually work. They don't all work the same. This resonates a little bit with me because I just talked about this a couple weeks ago in the 180 degree rule episodes, where I talked about the way that deck builders have different changes to the basic understanding of what a deck builder is. If you think of the Dominion model, you have a market of cards. On your turn, you can do a thing that scores you points, or you can do a thing that scores you card buying power, and you discard your hand at the end of the turn. That's kind of the standard deck building. And when you buy a card, it goes on your discard pile. The things that Dominion does are what 95% of the deck builders do. But then, with each successive deck building game, they introduce new options that change the expectations about what would happen when you buy cards in a deck builder. You know, there are some that you put the card right in your hand, like in Abandon All Artichokes. In fact, Abandon All Artichokes also gets rid of the currency part. You just, when you buy a card, you buy it. It goes right in your hand. You don't have to buy it. You always take one card. In fact, you have to take one card, which is another interesting difference. You also get the fascinating idea of a deck builder where you also get the fundamental change of a deck builder where there's a river of cards instead of a single market, like in Dominion. So you have a deck of cards with a river of cards that come out. This is what happens with the Harry Potter deck builder with Ascension. This is, I think, the first game that really did that. It's kind of a standard now, alternate way to do it. to the point where the market is actually not all that standard anymore, or most games use a mix of those. But I would say the biggest change, the biggest place where teaching people how to play the game fundamentally changes what they expect out of the game, is going to be the Martin Wallace deck builders, A Study in Emerald, Mythotopia, A Few Acres of Snow, A Handful of Stars. In these 4 games, you still have the deck building that you would expect in these other games, but you don't discard cards at the end of your turn. Most deck builders, you're going to draw 5 cards on your turn. You're going to discard them when your turn is done. Boom, that's how it works. That's how it always works. In Martin Wallace deck builders, no, you only discard them when you use them. Or you could take an action to discard them, which is using up one of your 2 precious actions on a turn. Now, I did bring this up in the 180-degree rule because it does specifically kind of fit that mold. But I think it makes for a really interesting change in the play that people are playing, and I suspect that there are people who play these games wrong. They start playing one of these games, and since in these games you always discard cards and draw up, I bet there are people who just do that, and then they discover later, oh wait, you're not supposed to do that? And it flummoxes you. It changes completely the way that you understand what to do with the game if you keep those cards. And it also makes the cards that don't do anything, or the bad cards, way worse. In some games you get these hand clogging cards and they limit your ability to use your hand for 1 turn. In Martin Wallace's game, they limit your ability to use your hand until you use them, which often they're subpar and you don't want to use them. But yeah, it's brutal. Really kind of a rough approach, but I love it. I mean, that's part of what makes those games so fun. Yeah, so that's the Martin Wallace deck builders, which kind of, break 180-degree rule. Well, thanks for joining me today. I hope that this first half of the conversation about what you expect out of games and how those games follow or break the rules that you expect was entertaining and enjoyable. I look forward to discussing it more with you in tomorrow's episode. Until then, thanks for joining me. I hope your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.